What we see really is a dynamic here of Paul offering us a high view of marriage and a high view of singleness.
Right.
And this is what's so refreshing for today's church.
Hello, and joined today by Barry Danylak, who this morning at coffee time in Tyndale House gave us a copy of his new book, Paul and Secular Singleness, in 1 Corinthians 7. Barry, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to have you with us today, and exciting for you to be presenting the book at coffee time this morning. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure.
Where are you based? What do you do there?
Right.
Yeah.
So I am a missionary pastor. So I'm ordained with the Evangelical Missionary Church of Canada.
Uh-huh.
I am based in Calgary, Alberta, and I serve as the executive director of an organization called C Global, which is a very small organization, mostly consisting of myself and a few great volunteers and collaborators. And our mission really is to equip the church on issues around singleness, marriage, and family around the world.
Right.
We are recognizing the reality of a world in which marriage is declining. And so our mission really is to think deeply and theologically in a constructive way about singleness, but then also about marriage, family, and kind of the broader rubric of life within the body of Christ.
Fantastic.
And so that's what we do, and that's what I've been a part of here for my last 4 years. And before that, I was a pastor, working in one of Canada's large churches.
Right.
And I do a little bit of teaching on the side as well.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Great. And what's the background then to your work in this area? So you've been doing this for 4 years.
Right.
You've been working on this book slightly longer than 4 years, which we'll come back to in a moment. Just give us a little bit of the backstory.
There's a little bit of a backstory. As I worked for many years as really a lay leader in my church, which originally got my interest in academia, on this issue of a theology of singleness. So that really formed into a nucleus of work, which became an earlier work I did in 2010 with Crossway Publishers, called Redeeming Singleness, so a book on the theology of singleness, kind of a biblical theology. That, of course, opens the door to, well, what about 1 Corinthians 7 and this very challenging passage of 40 verses that Paul gives us in the New Testament, the most extended discussion of marriage in the New Testament, and yet probably one of the most profoundly misunderstood or hard to understand or difficult passages. So it really opened my curiosity to say, how do we get our head around it?
Right.
And that opened the door at the same time to connect with the then warden of Tyndale House, Bruce Winter, who was also a man of the sources and interested in Corinthians and New Testament backgrounds and Greco-Roman world and that. So it really opened the door of exploration for me on how do we place Paul in his context.
Right. So when did you first come to Tyndale House?
Oh my goodness. Well, it's been 20 years ago. So it was 2004.
Right.
In the fall, I enrolled and began my studies here. And fortunately, I was able to finish, I think I completed my studies in 2012.
Okay. PhD studies.
PhD studies, right. But it's taken another 12 years to sort of get from that work and that time to sort of a readable version for the general academic community.
So this is an academic monograph that's based on your thesis.
Correct.
But is quite adapted from it.
Adapted, updated, and made a bit more readable than the actual thesis itself. So it's intended for somebody to be able to navigate through it and not have to know Greek and Hebrew and Latin to survive.
Right.
So.
Who is this book for?
Right. This book...
Well, perhaps you should tell us a bit about what the book is.
Yes.
You've kind of alluded to it in what you said about your PhD work, but yeah, tell us a little bit more about what's in this.
Right. So the title, which some might find curious, Paul and Secular Singleness in 1 Corinthians 7, begs the question of what do we mean by secular singleness? And so what in the world is that? And what does it have to do with Paul and his writing of 1 Corinthians? And I think the best way to just open it is to contrast it in that oftentimes the singleness that became largely a focus within the church is a monastic, a spiritual type of singleness, which considered it to be a spiritual discipline. Right? So this is a spiritual exercise, a spiritual discipline that evolved into the monastic movement of the Middle Ages and so on. There's many who place the beginnings and the origins of that in 1 Corinthians itself, in the context of the Corinthian environment that Paul's engaging. What this book really attempts to do is challenge the kind of prevailing assumption that there's some sort of a pre-monastic, ascetic, possibly Gnostic view that was anti-marriage, anti-sex and body, and was really a movement within Corinth and the Corinthian audience that Paul's engaging with, and moves to suggest that no, maybe the Corinthians were much more like 21st century Europeans and Western culture in having a much more secular disposition of not marrying for much more personal reasons and for the personal benefit of that would entail. So it really sees marriage and singleness primarily in the rubric of a political decision rather than a theological, religious decision, which we often think of it, this is, part of my commitment as a religious ceremony, when in fact, for I think much of the audience Paul's engaging with, marriage was much more of a political act of, first of all, obedience to the empire. As there was marriage laws, it was part of the legal fabric of society. But then also from the standpoint of being sort of a political citizen of bearing children, raising children as part of building and facilitating the imperial purposes that were present at the time. So I think what we begin to do here is try to place Paul in I think a more probable environment of a politically motivated decision that he's finding in the case of the Corinthians, as well as a philosophically informed audience. We clearly know that the Corinthians were philosophically astute. We know from Luke that Paul was engaging with Epicureans and Stoics in Athens just prior to coming to Corinth. So we know that these things are in the air. It's part of the the whole climate in which Paul is working with the Corinthians. And so really what we're looking to do in this book is to place Paul back in that environment. And with the addition, I think the other thing, if I might say, we seek to do here, Tony, is take advantage of a broader range of sources.
Yeah, I was about to ask about that.
So one of the benefits of working here in Cambridge is the commitment to engagement with the source material. And when I first arrived, working under the supervision of Dr. Winter, he very much wanted me to be a student of the sources and not just the typical Jewish,
Right.
Philo and Josephus,
yeah.
and we have a kind of our common ones,
Yeah.
but to actually get to what about material sources? So what
Okay.
about the papyri? What
Right,
about the
right.
epigraphy?
Can you just explain what you mean by epigraphy for people who are not familiar with that term?
Right. So epigraphy is just really looking at the stones, at particularly things like gravestones and any sort of engraved writing that was common to the ancient world, because they documented so much in
Right.
stone
Yeah,
in
right.
ways that we no longer do so much. So the papyri sources are another. We have a mountain of papyri that has been recovered from mid 20th century on to the present, that continues to be of benefit for us as scholars. So, for example, one of the things we look at is some of the census data. We recall from Luke that Augustus takes a census,
right,
which brought, of course,
Okay,
Mary and
yeah,
Joseph
yeah.
down to Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And yet, what's amazing is that so much of that has been recovered and
Really?
documented. So
what kind of data are they collecting? I mean, when I think of a contemporary census, they're asking all kinds of questions.
Right.
But I imagine that I always assumed that an ancient census was just counting people up, writing the names down, and that.
Well, and
so it's somewhere between the two, is it?
we assume it's basically for taxes. It's about the
Yeah,
money,
right,
because
right.
we think
Yeah.
of all the tax collectors.
Sure.
And that. In fact, the census the data presents quite a bit of information on family structure.
Oh, interesting.
So we know what a typical household consisted of. Which of course would include not only the parents and children, it could include in-laws, grandparents,
Right,
uncles,
right.
aunts. It would include the slaves that might have been in the household, and it might also include boarders. So often households would have people living, coming and going, particularly larger households.
Right.
And so much of this, of course, the vast majority has all been lost,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it was typically written on papyri, which is easily, it doesn't keep. But of course, in Egypt, we have benefited from just loads of papyri that has maintained the test of time through being buried in the sands and the climate conducive to its preservation.
Yes.
And so what scholars have been able to do is recollect that. What interesting points does that give us, one might ask? Well, one of the most interesting things is the dynamic of men and women in Roman society, particularly when we move from the rural areas into cities.
Right.
So Paul, Jesus is working from village to village, right? He's going the small Jewish villages.
Yeah.
Paul, on the other hand, is going from city to city in the Greco-Roman Empire.
Right.
So we're now talking mostly with a completely different. We forget, Paul is a missionary in his missionary journeys. He is taking the gospel to people that culturally are completely of a different world, understanding, worldview.
Right.
They're also highly urbanized. Most of Paul's letters are written to cities.
Because he's going to the strategic centers,
yes,
isn't he?
the
commercial
strategic
centers,
places of the commercial, of Rome and Ephesus and Corinth.
Right.
And so what that means is that the dynamic that Paul's engaging with is an urban population. And what the census data would suggest is that there tended to be a displacement of male migration into cities looking for work,
Right.
which would create a bit of an imbalance between males and females. And it raises the interesting question of what does that mean for city life in a typical Greco-Roman city, right? If you have more men than women. Well, One, as has been documented by other scholars, is you're gonna have a prostitution problem, which, of course, is very evident in Paul's discussion right there in 1 Corinthians prior to his marriage discussion. But it also means you're going to have a preponderance of single male, unmarried, and a potential shortage of potential eligible mates to marry. Right. So that is part of the sort of in the current of the background that is most likely going on in the context of an urban environment like Corinth.
That's very interesting.
So it's important for how we read the text and how we understand certain bits of Paul's discussion.
Right.
At a number of points, Paul. One of the side effects as well that we can document is that women would have been more empowered to divorce in an environment where there's a relative shortage of women. Sure. And we see that, which is interesting because when Paul talks about divorce, he goes first to the women, not to the men. He says, concerning those who are married, let a woman not be separated from her husband. Right. And then there's an extended discussion there, and only a passing comment, and let not the husbands divorce their wives. Yeah. So there's something there that says, why would he focus on women unless women had a bit more ability to marry and remarry? Right. And that informs a bit of the dynamic. Particularly among men who were likely unfaithful to their wives as a cultural phenomenon.
Right, yes.
In general.
Yes.
So, knowing the words of Jesus, which Paul seems to make reference to as well in 1 Corinthians 7, I think there's reason to think it's probably an extended commentary on Jesus' teaching in Matthew 19 and in the Synoptics, where he also talks about marriage, singleness, and divorce. Yep. And so Paul is aware, certainly, of, the permission structure of Jesus gives for unfaithful, for divorce. And so he's informing and highlighting, based on their context in a pastoral way that doesn't give free rein to the women to remarry, but acknowledges, yes, if the men are unfaithful, you can divorce if you remain single and faithful in singleness. Right. So what we see really is a dynamic here of Paul offering us a high view of marriage and a high view of singleness. Right. And this is what's so refreshing for today's church, that we really we want to be teaching, we want to be preaching a high view of marriage that respects it as God intended and ordained it, that sees our sexual relations to be located within the bond of that husband-wife relationship, but also doesn't diminish the goodness of those that do choose the celibate life, to honor God in this way, and the advantages of that that Paul makes clear as well. So he really gives us a powerful and profound vision for a high view of marriage and singleness, both in a balanced way within the Christian community. Right. That values the whole of the body of Christ, as I think was intended by Jesus and his ministry as well. Yeah, so,
brilliant. So to go back to the question that I diverted off,
yes,
this is an academic. More academic book. Who do you want to read this?
Right.
Because this is not a book for an ordinary church member, probably, is it?
Probably not.
Books based on PhDs don't tend to be.
They don't tend to be. So, exactly. So the question is, well, how is this a benefit to the average pastor in the pew or the average person that says, okay, this is not likely a book at its price of £100, by the way, that is likely to be picked up and bought by the average person. I think the best way to think about it is that I think it informs the discussion on 1 Corinthians 7, and particularly for those that are writing commentaries and books of understanding, So those that write the commentaries are going to read books like this.
Absolutely.
They're then going to try to give a best understanding of the worldview, the world in which Paul's ministering to in the commentary.
Yep.
Where it benefits the average pastor in preaching is the first thing one is told to exegete a passage is you need to know its context.
Yep.
So the basic core questions a pastor is going to want to know is, well, what's the context we're dealing with here? And on a passage like 1 Corinthians 7, context is so key to understanding and reading it properly.
Clearly.
That the first place one would go is to a good commentary that one trusts. And hopefully, if the commentary is reading books like this, it can bring to bear in kind of a succinct, useful way, kind of the context that then the pastor can quickly read and assess, draw to their own benefit to serve their congregants in the pew. And of course, for those that are the average church attendee, the benefit might be just in sitting under the good teaching of your pastor, who is careful in their preparation by reading the commentaries, which are relying on books like this. So there's a bit of a flow, a logical flow of ideas from books like this down into sort of the broader appreciation of the average person in the church.
It makes my heart rejoice when somebody writes a monograph, but the goal of it is to bless the church.
Absolutely.
Because if we just write monographs just for the sake of writing a monograph, we're not. Who are we helping?
Absolutely.
But the Lord gives us these opportunities in order to benefit His people, doesn't He? It's great to hear you express that so clearly.
Indeed.
So Tyndale House has played something of a role here then,
Yes.
from you being based here for your PhD. Yes. What has been the value, apart from encountering Bruce Winter and him pushing you to engage with the sources, what's been the value of being part of Tyndale House, connected with Tyndale House, and then returning here from time to time?
Yes, well, I'm phenomenally grateful for this place. In fact, I think I did jot down in the copy that I've left with Peter and the library that this book wouldn't exist apart from Tyndale House. And I think it's because of the not just the fact that you have such an excellent, superb collection of resources in one place, but also the community that's here. I would call it, a living community of academic growth and development and expansion. And so having the opportunity of meeting so many people over the years that I was here to not only discuss some of these topics with, I remember having endless discussions with David Instone Brewer on divorce, because he's of course written quite a bit, looking again at papyri sources for divorce and remarriage, and but so many of those discussions that I think stimulated the academic sort of exploration that was necessary to really be fruitful, not only as a PhD student, but in the broader sense to really seek a way to contribute to the life and growth of the church as a whole. And so I think Tyndale House has just been a exceptional example of a Christian community committed to high levels of robust academic scholarship in a context that benefits both students at the university pursuing PhD studies, but also pastors and other academics who are seeking to continue their research and writing for further benefit to the church. So it really brings together, I think, the best of both for healthy, stimulating discussions, and of course, obviously the connections with the journal and the larger foundation and Tyndale Fellowship has been extremely beneficial as well. So we're grateful for the vision that has been this place for, 70 years? What is it?
Yeah, that's 1945. We opened our doors in January of 1945.
We'll be coming up to 70 years. And is really...
It's more than 75 years now.
75 years, yes.
Yeah.
So, it's been just yes, indeed. We're getting closer to 80, aren't we? Yeah. Do the math. But the continued vision here that Peter and the staff and all of you have done has really enabled, I think, Tyndale to flourish and be a ever contemporary and forward-looking resource for scholarship for the next generation. So I'm just phenomenally grateful for this place, and I love to come back from time to time as the Lord opens the door to continue further work and see where how we can each continue studies and blessing the church as we have opportunity to do so.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for this really important work, and for the copy that's in the library. That will be well used by anybody who's working on 1 Corinthians here in the future. It's very satisfying to get to the end of any project, but when it's taken quite a few years, that must be particularly
especially satisfying to see it done.
Yes,
I think.
Absolutely. Is there one key thing you would like from this book to get into the minds of pastors who are preaching 1 Corinthians 7?
Yes. I think the one key thing is the world Paul is dealing with is a lot more like your world than maybe you have realized in the past. And I think that's of benefit for pastors to know.
Brilliant. Barry, thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony.